Greek creation myths do not form one single story, but a cluster of traditions preserved in Hesiod, Homer, and later Greek writers. The earliest accounts do not agree on every detail, yet they show how Greeks imagined the world beginning from disorder, separation, and divine succession. In Hesiod's Theogony, the sequence moves from chaos to the first powers, then to the generations of gods who make the cosmos stable enough for human life. Other traditions keep some of the same names but arrange them differently, and those differences matter. To understand these myths, it helps to start with the oldest surviving versions and then trace how later poets and philosophers inherited them. They were not only about origins, they also explained divine authority, ritual practice, and the place of mortals in a world ruled by older powers. In the oldest Greek poems, the world does not begin with a creator god shaping raw material into a finished design. It begins with a condition that is less precise than that: a gap, a void, an opening before anything stable has taken form. Hesiod's Theogony is the most important surviving source for this way of thinking, and it opens by naming chaos. The term is often translated as chaos, but that can be misleading if it suggests confusion in the modern sense. In Hesiod, chaos is not a messy world. It is the first absence, the opening from which later powers emerge. That distinction matters because Greek cosmogony is not simply a story about building, it is a story about differentiation. The earliest stage is not a world with borders, seasons, homes, or even the clear distinction between heaven and earth. It is a condition before those separations exist. The poets are trying to describe what comes before the familiar order of life, and that makes their language careful, compressed, and sometimes uncertain. When later readers ask what chaos looked like, they are already asking the wrong question. The point is not appearance. The point is precedence. Chaos comes first because it names the condition that allows anything else to appear. Other Greek traditions preserve different openings. Some begin with night, others with ocean, and some later thinkers tried to reduce cosmic origin to a single material principle such as water, air, or fire. But the oldest mythic account does not start with a fully formed element, it starts with a threshold. That is why the language of beginning in Greek myth often feels less like architecture and more like genealogy. One thing follows another, one presence makes room for the next. The cosmos is not yet a completed structure, but a sequence of arrivals. This is also the point at which Greek myth becomes difficult to separate from early Greek thought more broadly. The poets are not writing philosophy in the later sense, yet they are already asking philosophical questions in mythic form. What exists first? What makes separation possible? How does a stable order come out of what is undefined? Hesiod answers by naming divine beings, not abstract laws, but those beings are also functions of the world. They are not decorative figures added after the fact. They are the means by which the world becomes thinkable. In Hesiod's sequence, chaos is followed by other fundamental powers, including Earth, Tartarus, and Eros. Their appearance is important because it shows that the beginning is not empty in the modern sense of nothingness. It is productive. Earth gives a foundation, a place that can support later generations of gods and mortals. Tartarus introduces depth and distance, a realm of separation below the surface world. Eros, in this early context, is not later love or desire, but a binding force that allows generation to happen at all. These figures do not belong to Olympus yet. They belong to the pre-Olympian world, where the basic conditions of existence are still being established. Hesiod's ordering also matters because it is not the only possible ordering. Later Greek authors reshaped the genealogy to fit new theological or philosophical aims. Orphic traditions preserved in later sources often begin in a more elaborate and symbolic way, sometimes with time, sometimes with night, and sometimes with an egg-like origin or another primordial source from which the first divine beings are born. These versions are not just poetic decoration, they show that Greek communities and authors were still trying to explain the same problem from different angles. How to describe origin without reducing it to ordinary human making. A beginning that is truly first has to be imagined differently from a house, a tool, or a city. The early mythic language also reflects a culture that understood the world through relationship and inheritance. Greek religion did not separate cosmic history from cult practice as sharply as modern readers sometimes expect. The powers named at the beginning of the Theogony are part of a divine family tree, and genealogy gives the poem its structure. In Greek society, lineages mattered because they established legitimacy, rank, and continuity. Hesiod uses the same logic to explain the universe. The world is not just assembled, it is descended. Each generation of beings marks a further step away from the undefined opening and toward the world that human beings can inhabit. That helps explain why the earliest stage feels so remote in the poems. There are no cities, no kings, no sacrifices, and no division between a human community and a settled divine order. Those come later. Before the gods take on their familiar roles, before Zeus becomes the ruler of the sky, the poem is concerned with the simplest possible question: how does anything begin to stand apart from anything else? The answer is not presented as a scientific theory, and it is not meant to be. It is mythic explanation, using divine names to express a reality that the poets believed could be remembered even if it could not be directly observed. The surviving evidence suggests that Greeks could imagine several first states at once. They did not always feel obliged to harmonize them into a single system. That flexibility is one reason these myths remain durable. A void, a darkness, a deep current, a primeval night, or a generative opening can each serve as an image for the same problem of origin. The differences matter because they reveal a living tradition, not a fixed textbook. In one poet's hands, the beginning is a gap. In another, it is a personified force. In another, it is a sacred genealogy reaching back beyond the world as it is known. So the first step in the Greek creation story is not the rise of a king of the gods or the making of the earth in finished form. It is the admission that, at the beginning, there was no settled world at all. There was only the uncertain prior state from which later powers would emerge. The next name in the earliest Greek cosmogony is Chaos, and in Hesiod's Theogony it appears before the other great powers take shape. The word can mislead if read in its modern sense of disorder. In the oldest poetic context, chaos is better understood as a gap, a void or an opening condition rather than confusion in the ordinary sense. It is not yet a world, and it is not yet a ruler. It is the unstable starting point from which other realities can emerge that matters, because Greek creation myth does not begin with a finished universe. It begins with a sequence of presences that are only partly described. Hesiod does not offer a technical account of matter or a full cosmology. He names figures that stand for conditions the Greeks recognized in experience: emptiness, depth, attraction, earth, sky, sea. These are not abstract ideas in the later philosophical sense, but they are also not simple characters in a human family story. They belong to both worlds at once. They are divine beings, and they are also names for the structure of reality. From chaos come some of the earliest powers. Hesiod places Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros among the first to emerge. The sequence is important, even though the poem is brief and not always detailed. Gaia is earth, Tartarus is the deep place below the surface, a lower region associated in later tradition with punishment and confinement, though in Hesiod it first appears as a cosmic depth. Eros is desire, attraction, or the force that brings things together. Later Greek poetry and philosophy would develop all three in different ways, but the archaic poem already treats them as fundamental. The uncertainty around these figures is part of what makes them so old. Gaia is easy to identify because her name is plain and her role is clear. Tartarus is harder because it is both a place and, at this early stage, almost a presence of depth itself. Eros is more difficult still because the word does not yet mean the later personified god of romantic love in a simple form. In Hesiod's account, Eros is the power by which things join, reproduce, and come into being. That is a larger function than affection. It is the pressure toward generation. The Greek myths do not always agree about the order in which these forces appear, or even whether they should be described as beings at all. Later poets sometimes made the sequence more orderly than it seems in Hesiod. Orphic traditions, for example, can begin from night, time, or a cosmic egg, rather than from the same set of first powers. But Hesiod remains the clearest early witness for the line of development that later readers usually mean when they speak of Greek creation myth. He gives the listener a small number of names that stand at the edge of explanation. What is striking is that none of these powers yet produces an ordered universe by itself. Chaos is a beginning, but not a structure. Gaia is the earth, but not yet the world fully populated by gods and mortals. Tartarus is depth, but not yet a fully mapped underworld. Eros is the urge toward union, but not yet a complete family or society. The cosmos is starting to distinguish itself, yet it remains unfinished. That unfinished quality is central to the myth. The Greeks were not imagining a single act of engineering carried out from above. They were imagining a sequence in which reality takes shape through the appearance of powers that can be named, recognized, and later related to one another. The first step is not domination, it is differentiation. The world begins to separate into the things that can support life, the things that lie beneath it, and the force that brings new things into being. In that sense, the cosmogony is already explaining more than origin. It is explaining why the world has layers, limits, and relations, rather than remaining an undivided expanse. Hesiod's version also matters because it sits at the edge of a long oral tradition and a later literary culture. The Theogony is usually dated to the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, though exact dating is debated. It is a poem, not a temple record or a philosophical treatise, and that shape affects what it preserves. Its language is compressed, and its sequence often suggests older material that had already been remembered in more than one form. For that reason, the poem is valuable not only for what it says, but for how it says it. The first powers are introduced as if the audience already knows that they belong to a recognized cosmic pattern. The poem does not pause to define them in exhaustive prose. It names them and moves forward. Later readers often miss how carefully the poem balances personification and place. Tartarus, for example, eventually becomes the name of a region of punishment in Greek and Roman literature, but in this early layer of tradition, it is not yet only a prison for the wicked. It is a cosmic depth, a lower boundary in the arrangement of the universe. The same is true of Gaia. She is Earth as a divine being, but she is also the ground beneath all life and the source from which other forms will arise. This overlap between deity and domain is characteristic of early Greek cosmogony. A power is not merely represented by a figure, the figure is the power. Once these first presences exist, they make later generation possible. Gaia will not remain simply a passive surface. She will become the source of the sky, the mountains and the sea lineages that follow in the poem. Eros will ensure that being does not remain static. Tartarus will help define the vertical structure of the cosmos by marking what lies below. Even before the more familiar gods appear, the poem has already established the principle that the universe is relational. Nothing is isolated for long. The first powers create conditions in which other beings can emerge, oppose one another, and be organized into succession. So at this stage of the story, the ancient Greek cosmos is still spare and provisional. Chaos has been named. Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros have entered the account. But the world they belong to has not yet been arranged into family lines, divine kingship, or stable realms. The first cosmic presences now exist, but the ordered world is still ahead. What comes next is not simply more scenery or a list of gods. Gaia is the point at which Greek creation myth becomes more than a list of beginnings. In Hesiod's Theogony, she is not just soil or landscape. She is Earth itself, an ancestral divine presence with the power to generate, support, and endure. That matters because the story is no longer only about what comes first in an abstract sense. It is now about the conditions that make every later god, monster, and mortal possible. Earth is not a passive setting. She is one of the first powers to exist on her own, and the later mythic world grows out of her. This is one reason Gaia is so central in Greek religion and literature. The Greeks could speak of the ground beneath their feet, the fertility of fields, the stability of settlement, and the ancient authority of the earth in one figure. Gaia can be read as a goddess, but she also works as a cosmological principle. She is the foundation on which everything else depends. Even before the sky is fully opposed to the earth, and before the divine family takes recognizable shape, Gaia gives the story a stable axis. She is the first thing in the myth that suggests permanence. Hesiod's language is restrained, but the idea is large. Gaia came to be after chaos, and from her later generations will emerge. In that sense, she belongs to the oldest layer of primordial beings rather than to the later Olympian order. Yet she is also different from the others named at the start. Chaos suggests opening or gap. Tartarus suggests depth. Eros suggests attraction or joining. Gaia, by contrast, has a concrete and visible identity. She is the earth that can hold up mountains, receive the dead, and bring forth life. Her presence makes the cosmos legible. Once Earth exists, there is something to stand on, something to divide from the sky, and something that can become a lineage. That sequence is important in Hesiod because it gives the universe a structure that resembles genealogy. The world is not described as a finished machine, it is described as a family of powers that arise joined, separate, and hand on their place to the next generation. Gaia belongs to the oldest layer of that family. She is present before the familiar drama of fathers, sons, and rival kings begins, and that lets Hesiod anchor later divine conflict in something older than conflict itself. She is not a result of those struggles. She is one of the conditions that makes them possible. Later Greek writers often leaned on this dual role. When a poet invokes Gaia, the word can mean the earth as a whole, the ground of a landscape, or a divine ancestor with memory and authority. That flexibility helped the myth survive. It also explains why Gaia appears so often in stories of birth, oath, punishment, and succession. She is not only fertile, she is ancient. She knows the older order because she precedes most of it. In some traditions, that makes her a witness to divine injustice. In others, it makes her the one who can still be appealed to when younger gods have not yet secured power. The succession stories that follow in Greek myth depend on that authority. Gaia will not remain a silent background figure. In Hesiod and in later mythographic traditions, she becomes involved in the rise and fall of divine rulers, especially when the first generations create disorder that has to be corrected. Her role is often tied to the tension between generative power and control. Earth gives birth, but she also endures what is born from her, including beings that become a burden or a threat. That is one of the darker and more realistic aspects of the Greek imagination. Creation does not appear as pure blessing. It brings scale, conflict, and consequence. It is important, though, not to flatten Gaia into a modern idea of Mother Earth and leave it there. The ancient Greek picture is more specific. Gaia is generative, but she is not sentimental. She is tied to the earth as a literal body, which means she can be burdened and drawn into family conflict. Later succession myths will make that matter a great deal. For now, the key point is that the earth is no longer a formless possibility. It has become a named divine being with agency. In Greek thought, that agency could be felt in the fertility of land, but also in the solidity of rock, the depth of graves, and the ancient claim that the earth itself can remember what human families forget. The Greeks also connected Gaia with older local forms of worship that likely predated any single literary account. Earth divinities were not unique to Greece, and many cultures imagined the land as alive, maternal, and authoritative. In Greece, however, Gaia's literary shape is especially tied to Hesiod's attempt to order the cosmos through sequence and relation. That means her emergence is not just a mythic event, it is also a literary solution. Hesiod needed a being who could stand at the center of a universe that was still taking shape. Gaia does that work because she is both immediate and enduring, both physical and divine. This emergence also helps explain the logic of the cosmogony as a whole. The myth is not rushing to populate the world with a full divine court. It is establishing the major conditions of life one by one. First there is opening, then depth, then desire, and now earth. That sequence turns the universe into something that can be inherited and contested. Once Gaia exists, the story can move from bare beginnings to relationships, and from relationships to ancestry. She is the first great foundation under everything that follows, and because of that, the next step is inevitable. Earth will not remain alone. Alongside Gaia, Hesiod places two more primordial presences at the start of the world, Tartarus and Eros. They matter because Greek cosmogony is not only about making solid things appear, it is also about giving the universe its first depths and its first impulses. Tartarus is the deep abyss below the earth, a place of extreme distance and separation. Eros is not yet the later god of romantic love in the familiar classical sense. In this earliest setting, he is better understood as attraction, generation, and the pressure that brings separate things together so that life can begin. Tartarus is the more straightforward of the two, though even he is not simple. In Hesiod's Theogony, Tartarus appears very early, before the full genealogy of the gods has taken shape. He is both a place and, in some sense, a primordial reality. Later Greek tradition would make Tartarus the deepest region of the underworld, a prison for defeated gods and dangerous beings. That later image is important, but it is not the whole story. At the beginning, Tartarus functions more like a cosmic depth beneath the earth than like a fully developed hell. The myth is marking out levels of reality, above, below, and within. If Gaia is the body of the earth, Tartarus is the distance under that body, the region where things can be hidden, confined, or removed from ordinary life. That idea of depth helps explain why Tartarus belongs at the beginning rather than later in the genealogy. Greek myth often turns physical features into divine powers, and Tartarus is the kind of place that had to exist once the cosmos gained structure. There must be an underplace if there is to be an overplace. Even in later poetry, Tartarus remains a boundary and a warning. He is not just darkness, but separation made permanent. The world is no longer an open beginning. It now has vertical order, and that order includes a lowest point. This matters in part because Hesiod's sequence is not random. The Theogony is building a cosmos that can support later generations of gods, monsters, and mortal life. Before Zeus, before the Olympian order, there must already be a system in which height and depth, closeness and remoteness can be meaningfully described. Tartarus belongs to that first ordering. He is not a fully narrated character with family stories attached. He is a condition. In that sense, he resembles other primordial beings in Hesiod, such as Chaos and Gaia, which are less like people and more like foundational realities given divine status. Eros is harder to pin down because his role changes across Greek literature. In later poetry and art, he becomes a personal god of love, often playful, sometimes dangerous, and usually tied to desire between individuals. In early cosmogony, especially in Hesiod, he is something older and broader than that. He is the force that draws beings together so that new life can emerge. He is the principle of union in a universe that has just begun to divide itself into distinguishable powers. Without Eros, the cosmos would remain a set of separate presences. With Eros, relationship becomes possible. That is why he appears so early. He does not belong to a finished world of lovers and marriages. He belongs to the stage where being itself is becoming generative. Some ancient interpretations treated Eros as the god who makes procreation possible in the biological sense. Others gave him a more abstract function, almost like a cosmic law of attraction. The surviving texts do not always agree on how to picture him, and that uncertainty is part of his significance. Greek myth often uses divine figures to name processes before it gives them stable stories. Eros is one of those figures. He is not yet the charming child of Hellenistic imagination or the winged archer of later iconography. He is a necessary condition of creation, a power that moves things out of isolation and into sequence, union, and fertility. Placed together, Tartarus and Eros reveal how carefully the earliest Greek cosmogony is balanced. One gives the world its depth and confinement. The other gives it movement toward generation. One makes room for a lowest region, the other makes room for continuity. Both are impersonal in a way that later myths are not. They are not introduced as household gods with temples, festivals, and elaborate stories attached to them. They are structural powers, part of the world's first working parts. This is one reason the early account feels so spare. It is not trying to explain everything at once. It is identifying the conditions that make later divine family drama possible. There is also a useful contrast here with later Greek religious imagination. In Olympian myth, gods usually act with recognizable personalities. They marry, quarrel, punish, and favor human beings. In the cosmogonic layer, by contrast, the figures are closer to principles than to characters. Tartarus is depth, Eros is connection, Gaia is earth. The story has not yet reached the more familiar social world of Zeus and his court. It is still laying down the architecture of reality. That makes the sequence important. The world begins not with kingship, but with terrain, distance, and attraction. Ancient sources outside Hesiod sometimes place these powers differently or omit one of them entirely. Orphic traditions, for example, often give a more elaborate role to nighttime or a cosmic egg, and they can describe the first ordering of the world in a different sequence. But even where the names shift, the underlying concern is similar. Greek cosmogony repeatedly asks how separation and union first entered reality. What makes height possible? What makes depth possible? What makes birth possible? Tartarus and Eros answer those questions in the language of divine origins. Hesiod's own poem gives these figures no extended narrative beyond their first appearance, which is also telling. Their function is to establish a framework, not to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end in the later literary sense. That restraint is part of the poem's method. Once the basic cosmic conditions are named, the account can move on to the more elaborate sequence of births that follows from them. Gaia's later offspring and the conflicts that grow out of those births depend on a world in which separation and attraction have already been imagined as primordial realities. In that sense, Tartarus and Eros are not side notes. They are part of the logic that allows the rest of the myth to unfold. By this point then, the cosmos is no longer only an opening and an earth. It has a below, and it has a force that makes creation possible. From that first ground, Greek cosmogony moves to one of its central ideas. Earth is not complete until she has a counterpart above her. In Hesiod's Theogony, Gaia does not remain a solitary foundation. She brings forth Uranus, the sky, and he comes into being as her equal, in the poem's plain phrase, to cover her on every side. The wording matters because it gives the event both a physical and symbolic shape. The sky is not treated as a distant abstraction. He is a matched presence, the thing that stands opposite Earth and completes the first visible structure of the cosmos. Earth below, sky above. Between them, the rest of divine history can begin. In Hesiod's sequence, this pairing follows Gaia's first emergence and comes before the larger family of divine beings takes form. That order is important. The poem does not begin with a finished world already filled with named gods. It begins with basic conditions, and then those conditions become persons. Gaia is the first stable ground, but she is also a being capable of generation. Uranus is not an afterthought or decoration. He belongs to the world's first architecture. The poem treats their relationship as the moment when space itself becomes legible, up, down, enclosure, and the possibility of separation. This is one reason Greek creation stories are often about genealogy as much as creation. The earliest powers do not simply make the world from outside, as if designing it in a modern sense. They generate later beings through relationship. Earth and sky become the first great pair, and from that pair comes the long line that leads to Titans, Olympians, and the familiar gods. In Greek myth, ancestry is not a side detail. It is a way of explaining why the world is arranged as it is, and why power passes from one generation to the next. A family tree becomes a map of the cosmos. Hesiod gives Uranus a role that is both cosmic and familial. He is the sky, but he is also a father. Later Greek readers could treat that union of meanings as natural, but it is worth pausing on. When earth and sky are personified, they are not scenery with human names attached. They are living presences, ancient and elemental, whose children will be powers in their own right. That helps give the Theogony its structure. It starts with broad conditions, then narrows into family lines, then turns those family lines into conflict. The poem is not only describing origins, it is also showing how authority is inherited, challenged, and replaced. The children of Gaia and Uranus belong to that older stage of divine history. In Hesiod, they are the generation before the Olympian gods, powers of a more archaic and unstable world. Their existence matters because it makes the later order possible. Once earth and sky have produced offspring, the poem can move toward division, rivalry, and succession. That pattern becomes one of the central engines of Greek myth. Creation is not a single act and then a settled result. It is the beginning of a series of births, conflicts, and transitions in which one divine order gives way to another. Other Greek traditions handle the beginnings differently. Some local theogonies and later philosophical writers prefer other first principles. In some accounts, the world begins from ocean or from night or from a more abstract source such as air or mind. Those versions do not erase Hesiod's pattern, but they show that Greek myth never had one fixed opening. Even so, the pairing of earth and sky became one of the most durable structures because it is easy to connect to experience. Anyone looking upward can imagine the sky as a vast fatherly presence. Anyone standing on the land can imagine Earth as the mother beneath and around all life. The image is simple, but it carries weight. It turns geography into divine ancestry. The union of Gaia and Uranus also helps explain why Greek myth so often links fertility with order. Earth alone can be imagined as abundant, but without sky there is no pairing, no distance, and no structured generation. The sky above the earth creates a world with dimensions. It makes room for motion, for birth, and eventually for separation. In that sense, Uranus is more than a name in a family tree. He represents the first stable above, just as Gaia represents the first stable below. The cosmos starts to look less like a void and more like a layered realm with defined places. That layered structure is also what allows myth to organize succession, since each generation can now be placed within a setting that already has shape. That is why later Greek mythographers and poets could treat earth and sky as the earliest parents of a larger divine population. Their children are not yet the Olympians, they belong to an earlier age of the world, but the essential pattern is already there. Once earth and sky exist together, the myth can begin to think about generation in a more structured way. The heavens are no longer only an absence over the land. They are a divine being in relation to earth herself. Once earth and sky have been named as the first great pair, Greek cosmogony begins to thicken into a more familiar ancestry. The world is no longer only a division between above and below. It also becomes a landscape with named features, and those features are given divine parentage. In Hesiod's Theogony, Gaia does not simply bear sky, she also brings forth the mountains, the Rhea, and the sea, Pontus. The point is not geography in a modern sense, it is that the oldest parts of the earth and the sea are imagined as ancient powers in their own right, older than human cities and older than the gods who will later rule from Olympus. The Rhea show how Greek myth treats the natural world. Mountains are not dead stone. They belong to Gaia's generative body, which places them in the first age of creation. That matters because mountains in Greek thought were never just scenery. They marked boundaries, shelter, height, and distance from ordinary human life. They were also places where divine presence could be imagined more easily than in lowlands and farms. By making the mountains children of Gaia, the myth gives those features a place inside sacred history. They are not afterthoughts. They belong to the original shaping of the earth. In a Greek setting, that placement has consequences. A mountain can be a cult site, a frontier, a route marker, or the home of nymphs and divine attendants. Even when a particular mountain is not named in this early genealogy, the idea is already present that elevated places are older than human settlement and charged with meaning from their origin. Pontus works in a similar way, though he belongs to a different kind of space. In Hesiod, Pontus is the sea personified as a primordial offspring of Gaia, not yet the domain of Poseidon in the later Olympian sense. That distinction matters. The sea in early Greek myth is not just water, It is an old and powerful expanse that exists before the world has settled into the divine order familiar from later epic. Pontus is part of the ancient architecture of the cosmos, not merely a realm to be governed. Later tradition often treated the sea as Poseidon's territory, but the older genealogy gives it a deeper origin, one that places it beside earth and sky as part of the first divine world. Hesiod also preserves another oceanic figure in the same poem, Oceanus, who is not the same as Pontus. That difference is easy to miss, but it shows how carefully Greek tradition could distinguish kinds of water, the encircling stream of Oceanus, the open sea of Pontus, and the divine rulers who would later be associated with maritime power. There are different ways to read these births, and the surviving sources do not always force the same emphasis. Hesiod's account is the clearest surviving literary sequence, and it presents these powers as Gaia's offspring after chaos and the first cosmic realities have appeared. That gives the landscape itself a family tree. Earth produces not only children who become actors in myth, but also the great features that define the world in which those actors will live. Mountains and sea are not secondary details. They are part of the first ordering of reality. Later poets and local traditions could shift the emphasis, sometimes linking a particular mountain or sea route to a god, hero, or foundation story. But those later associations rest on the older idea that the Earth's large forms are not mute matter. They have origin, relation, and place within the divine order. This helps explain why Greek cosmogony feels both abstract and concrete at the same time. It begins with enormous concepts, but it quickly turns them into places people could recognize. A mountain is not just a mass of rock. A sea is not just a body of water. Each can be imagined as a primal presence with a place in the oldest story about how the world took shape. That gives later myth a stable backdrop. When gods and heroes move through the Greek world, they do so through terrain that has already been folded into divine genealogy. A journey across the sea is never only travel. A climb into the mountains is never only movement uphill. The geography is already charged with the memory of creation. The pattern also helps explain why Greek myth can speak about nature in a personal way without turning every feature into a fully individual god. The mountains and the sea are not yet the richly developed figures of later narrative. They are older than that. Their importance lies in their primacy. They show that the world was thought of as alive from the beginning, not simply inhabited by divine beings after the fact. Even the broad contours of the land were imagined as born from Earth herself. This does not mean the Greeks had one uniform doctrine about nature. Different poets, local cults, and later interpreters worked with these figures in different ways. But Hesiod's model became highly influential because it gave a simple and durable structure to the world, from the first opening to earth and sky, and then to the great formations that make the earth habitable and meaningful, so the genealogy widens. First, there was the opening from which order could begin. Then came earth and sky, the basic relation that made structure possible. Now the myth adds the great shapes of the world itself, the mountain heights and the sea's expanse. Greek cosmogony is turning landscape into ancestry, and ancestry into a map of the cosmos. By doing that, it prepares the way for everything that follows in the divine generation. With the landscape now given divine ancestry, Greek cosmogony turns to the generation that later stories treat as the most important children of earth and sky. In Hesiod's Theogony, these are the offspring of Gaia and Uranus, who belong to the age before Zeus, the Titans, the Cyclopes, and the hundred-handed beings called the Hecatonchires. Other traditions preserve different lists or different emphases, but the basic idea stays the same. Once earth and sky exist, their union produces a powerful second generation, and that generation is already marked by difference. Some children are associated with vast strength, some with craftsmanship, and some with force so excessive that even the ancient poets seem to treat them cautiously. The Titans are the best known of these descendants. In the most familiar Hesiodic list, there are 12 of them, though the names and number are not perfectly uniform across later sources. Among them are Oceanus, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Tethys, and Cronus. That list matters because it shows how Greek myth often works, not as a single fixed genealogy, but as a tradition that can preserve a shared core while allowing local and poetic variation. Some names are tied to broad natural or cosmic functions. Oceanus suggests the encircling river or sea. Hyperion is linked with heavenly brightness. Mnemosyne is memory itself. Themis stands for order or custom. These are not ordinary characters in a modern sense. They are ancient powers imagined as persons, and the names often point to the force they represent. The Titans also form the bridge between the first generation of cosmic beings and the later family of Olympian gods. In Hesiod, several of them are especially important because they become parents of major figures in the next stage of the mythic sequence. Rhea is the mother of Zeus and his siblings. Cronus becomes the central Titan ruler before Zeus. Mnemosyne later bears the Muses. Rhea is associated with celestial brilliance through her children. In other words, the Titans do not simply stand for a remote age that ends and disappears. They are part of the ancestry of the world Greeks knew through cult, poetry, and local tradition. Their place in the genealogy explains why the later gods can claim both continuity and replacement. The new order does not appear out of nothing. It rises from an older divine family. The Cyclopes and Hecatonchyres belong to the same generation, but their forms set them apart. The Cyclopes are usually one-eyed giants, though later literature can shift their role. In Hesiod, they are not simply monsters. They are craftsmen as well, the divine smiths who later make Zeus's thunderbolt. Their names in the Theogony, Brontes, Steropes and Arges, carry meanings tied to thunder and light. That is one reason scholars are careful about treating Greek myth as one simple set of creatures versus gods. The Cyclopes can be fearsome, but they are also useful, and in this tradition they are part of the machinery of cosmic power. Their presence suggests that force and technology are already joined in the divine world. Thunder is not just noise in the sky, it can be fashioned, given and directed. The Hecatonchyres are even more extreme. Their names, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, are usually given in Hesiod, and the important thing about them is not just their number of hands, but what that number implies. They are beings of overwhelming force, the kind of figures that ancient poetry uses to mark a world too large and dangerous for ordinary order. Later retellings sometimes keep them in the background, but in the early genealogy they matter because they make the divine family feel immense and unstable. The world is not only being populated, it is being crowded with powers that do not yet have a settled place. Their excess is important. In mythic terms, that excess is not a mistake. It signals a cosmos still in formation, one in which power appears before hierarchy is fully established. This is where the different traditions become especially important. Hesiod gives one of the most influential accounts, but not the only one. Some local stories and later mythographers preserve slightly different arrangements of the first divine children. The broad pattern remains recognizable. A primary generation gives rise to a second, and that second generation is already more complex than the first. It contains the beginnings of specialization. Some offspring are linked to sky brightness, some to memory, some to law, some to oceans, some to violent force, some to craftsmanship. Greek myth is not yet describing a tidy pantheon. It is showing how the cosmos accumulates powers that must eventually be sorted, governed, or restrained. There is also a practical reason these figures remain so durable in Greek tradition. They helped explain why divine power could feel both unified and fragmented. A world ruled by one god alone is not the same as a world in which thunder, memory, law, the sea, and generative force each have their own divine ancestry. The genealogy gives those features a place in the story of origins. It also allows later cult and poetry to draw on older layers of meaning without erasing them. A deity like Themis could be invoked in context of justice and social order. Mnemosyne could be tied to poetry and remembrance. Oceanus could remain a cosmological figure at the edge of the known world while also preserving the older sense of a surrounding, life-giving body of water. The names survive because they are useful across different settings. That is why these children matter for the larger story. They are not just a long family list before the real action begins. In the logic of the myth, they are the pressure that makes conflict inevitable. A divine family with this much force cannot remain undisturbed for long. Even before any direct rebellion appears, the genealogy itself suggests tension. Earth has produced beings strong enough to shape the world, and Sky has fathered children who will not stay quietly enclosed within the same order that brought them into being. Uranus is the first father in the Greek creation stories to act out of fear of his own children. In Hesiod's Theogony, he is the sky, joined to Gaia, the earth, and the trouble begins with what their union produces. Their children are not minor figures. They are the early divine powers who will shape the mythic family that follows, including the Titans, the Cyclopes, and the hundred-handed beings known in later tradition as the Hecatonchyres. Uranus does not accept that succession. Instead, he keeps the younger children shut away inside Gaia, preventing them from rising into the world. That detail gives the episode its force. The sky is not simply above the earth in a neutral way, it is pressing down on it. Gaia, already presented as the ground of life, becomes the place where her own children are trapped. The result is more than family conflict in a modern sense. It is a cosmic blockage. The next generation exists, but it cannot emerge. In Hesiod's poem, that failure of release turns birth itself into pain and tension. The imagery is physical, but it also has a social shape. Generation follows generation, yet authority refuses to pass on. Hesiod is brief about Uranus's motives. He says that Uranus hated his children and would not let them come into the light. Later traditions make that fear easier to see. Uranus is often said to dread their strength, especially the more unruly and formidable offspring among them. That explanation fits a wider pattern in Greek myth, where a ruler's fear of replacement becomes the reason he tries to stop the next generation before it can act. Some ancient interpreters treated this as a mythic image of a sovereign trying to prevent succession before it happens. Others saw it as a way of explaining why the younger divine order must eventually break through the first one. However it is read, the pattern is the same. The first father does not merely create. He also tries to control what creation will become. The story matters because this is where the family history of the gods becomes a history of conflict over power. The world is not moving smoothly from one generation to the next. It is being blocked by the very force that brought the children into being. Gaia carries that contradiction, and in the surviving tradition she can no longer endure it. In Hesiod, she is the one who responds. She produces the sickle that will later be used against Uranus, and she urges her children to act. That detail is important because it makes the break in the cosmos feel planned rather than accidental. The Earth is not only a passive victim here, it becomes the place where resistance is prepared. In some versions, Gaia complains from within the story of the world itself, and that complaint turns the myth from a story of birth into a story of resistance. Once the children are hidden inside her, the question is no longer only what has been born, but who will act against the suppression. The trapped children are not simply waiting in silence. Their confinement creates pressure on the order that contains them. The myth does not describe this as a political theory in the modern sense, but the structure is clear enough. Rule becomes unjust when it refuses succession, and that refusal produces the next act of change. Uranus's fear also prepares the next major turning point in the tradition. The children he tries to bury are not removed from the story. They are held back, and that delay makes their eventual return more decisive. Mythically, concealment is unstable. What has enough force to be shut away can also break loose. That is why the account moves toward Cronus, the youngest Titan, who will take the role of rebellion. Gaia's suffering and Uranus's refusal to let the children emerge make the rupture unavoidable. The first order of the cosmos has already become an order of pressure, and that pressure will not stay contained for long. This is also where Hesiod's version becomes especially influential, because it gives later Greek myth a pattern for repeated overthrow. The struggle between Uranus and his children is not only an isolated family event, it establishes a sequence that other myths will repeat in different forms. A ruler fears the younger powers, tries to prevent their rise, and creates the conditions for his own defeat. In that sense, Uranus belongs to the earliest layer of a much larger mythic history of succession. Among the surviving Greek accounts, Cronus becomes the one who can finally answer that pressure. Hesiod names him as the youngest of the Titans, and that detail gives the rebellion a logic of its own. The last child becomes the first to break the pattern of confinement. Gaia does not only mourn what Uranus has done, she helps shape the response. In the best-known version, she gives Cronus a curved blade, often translated as a sickle or scythe, and tells him how to wait for Uranus at the moment of union. The weapon matters because it is not a battlefield spear or a kingly sword. It is a tool turned into an instrument of separation, and that fits the larger myth, since the problem has been mixture without release, generation without succession. The curve of the blade also recalls older agricultural imagery, because the same kind of implement could harvest grain as well as cut flesh. Greek audiences would have understood that overlap. A tool meant to gather life can also be turned toward rupture. The ambush is brief in the telling, but it changes the structure of the world. Uranus comes down to Gaia, and Cronus strikes. Hesiod describes the act with bluntness. The sky is wounded and mutilated, and the poem treats that violence as a cosmic turning point rather than only a family crime. In later retellings, the details can shift, but the outline remains stable. The father who prevented birth is removed by the child who had been kept back. Greek myth often returns to this pattern of succession by overthrow, and this is one of its earliest and most forceful examples. Power does not pass smoothly. It is seized after a crisis inside the family itself. The myth does not suggest that the new ruler is gentle because the old one was harsh. It suggests instead that the first opening in the cosmos appears only after rupture. The severing also explains why this episode carries so many later associations. Uranus is not merely defeated, he is cut off from direct rule over Gaia. The separation of heaven and earth becomes part of the mythic memory of the act. Before this, the cosmos had been imagined as an undivided and cramped place, with the children trapped under the weight of their father's fear. Afterward, sky and earth can stand apart. That does not mean the world is orderly yet. It means only that space has opened where there had been compression. In this sense, the rebellion is not a political change in the modern sense. It is a cosmological one. The world becomes more legible because its elements are no longer forced into one another. Later Greek thinkers and poets could treat this as a primitive explanation for why the heavens seem lifted away from the earth. But the myth itself is less interested in physical description than in the principle that separation makes generation possible. Ancient sources do not preserve a single emotional reading of Cronus here. Hesiod presents the act as the necessary answer to Uranus's violence, and the poem gives Gaia a central role in planning it. Other later traditions place more emphasis on Cronus's own rule or on the moral consequences of what he does next. But in the earlier genealogy, the decisive point is that a younger power emerges only after older power has been resisted. Cronus is not yet a creator in the full sense. He is an agent of division, and division is what allows a new order to begin. In some later versions, Uranus's blood also produces further beings, including the Erinyes, the giants, and the Meliae, depending on the source. Those additions are not part of every account, but they reinforce the same idea. The act that ends one regime also generates new and often troubling forms of life. Violence does not simply remove a ruler. It leaves descendants, consequences, and debts behind. The weapon is also a reminder that Greek myth often ties political change to the language of cutting, binding, hiding, and release. Uranus had hidden his children inside Gaia. Cronus cuts the relationship apart. The myth does not soften that exchange, and it does not pretend that succession is peaceful. It gives a severe answer to a recurring problem in Greek cosmology. How can a world move forward if the first ruler refuses change? Here, it cannot until force breaks the blockage. In that sense, Cronus's rebellion is not simply revenge. It is a release from enclosure, though one bought at a terrible cost. The same logic that frees the children also establishes a new model for rule, where each generation may fear being overthrown by the next. That fear will become central to Cronus's own story. In the immediate aftermath, Uranus is no longer the active ruler of the cosmos. His defeat opens the way for Cronus's age, even if that age will prove unstable in its own way. The first great divine generation has been overthrown, and the pattern of rule now belongs to the Titans. But the myth has already made its deeper point clear. In the Greek imagination, the cosmos is not born finished. It comes into being through conflict between generations, and each victory carries the seed of the next crisis. That is why this episode matters in the larger sequence of Greek creation stories. In Hesiod's Theogony, the violence against Uranus does not end with his removal. It also creates new beings, and that matters because Greek creation myth often treats blood, earth, and sea as sources of life as well as suffering. What follows the overthrow is not a cleaner world, but one made more crowded and more dangerous. One line of tradition says that when Uranus's blood fell upon Gaia, it gave rise to the Erinyes, the avenging goddesses, along with the giants and the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs. Hesiod gives these births in compressed form, without much explanation, but later authors read them as signs that violated kinship produces new forces of punishment and endurance. The Erinyes are especially important. They are not monsters in a simple sense. They belong to a moral world in which bloodshed within a family calls forth its own answer. Their origin from Uranus's wound fits that pattern closely. The crime against a parent does not disappear. It remains in the fabric of the cosmos as a power that can pursue other acts of violence. The Erinyes later become central in Greek literature, especially in stories about family murder and broken oaths. In Homer, they already appear as powers, invoked in curses and as agents of retribution, while tragedy makes them unmistakably the guardians of kinship law and polluted blood. Their origin in the Theogony gives that later role a mythic foundation. They are not introduced as abstract judges, they emerge from a primal injury. Greek myth often works this way, tying a divine function to a story about origin. The violence that changes the divine order also produces the beings who will enforce its limits. The giants are sometimes connected to this same moment as children of the earth touched by divine blood. The sources are not perfectly consistent, and ancient authors do not present a single fixed account. But the basic idea is stable enough. From the meeting of earth and divine injury comes a generation marked by force and threat. The giants belong more fully to later mythic cycles than to the earliest creation sequence, yet their association with this primal conflict shows how Greek myth liked to trace later struggles back to the first wound in the family of the gods. In some later versions, they become opponents of the Olympians in a full divine war. That conflict makes more sense when they are first seen as products of a disrupted cosmic order. The Meliae, or ash tree nymphs, are a quieter version of the same pattern. They belong to the living landscape. In Greek imagination, even a tree nymph can emerge from divine violence. That is one reason these stories matter for early Greek thought. They do not separate nature from ancestry. They make the landscape itself part of sacred genealogy. The ash tree had practical value in the ancient world, especially for tools, weapons, and timber. So the appearance of ash tree nymphs in the aftermath of cosmic injury also links divine myth with the ordinary substance of the world. Nature is not decorative here, it is ancestral. Hesiod's version also gives the sea a role in the aftermath, and here the story becomes one of the most famous in Greek mythology. When Uranus's genitals are cast into the sea, foam rises around them, and from that foam Aphrodite is born. The Theogony is explicit and her name is tied to Aphros, the word for foam. Later readers often treat this as a beautiful origin story, but within the poem it is another example of how violence yields new divine life. The severing of the sky does not simply destroy, it transforms. The sea receives what has been cut away, and from that boundary between wound and water comes a goddess associated with desire, attraction, and generation. Aphrodite's birth has a special place in Greek cultural memory because it shows a different kind of emergence from the earlier births of Gaia. Gaia brings forth beings directly from herself. Aphrodite arises from a mutilation, and that difference has symbolic weight. In the most influential archaic Greek account, desire itself is linked to a cosmic rupture. Attraction is not presented as a soft or harmless force. It is born from division. That does not make Aphrodite a goddess of violence in a narrow sense, but it does place her within a world where generative power and disruption are closely connected. Hesiod's placement of her birth after the castration also helps explain why she can appear both as a force of union and as a power that unsettles boundaries. In later Greek thought, love and desire often move people beyond the limits they thought they could keep. Other traditions vary at the edges. Some local or later accounts modify the details of the births after Uranus's wound. And not every author names the same beings in the same way. The surviving evidence is uneven, and the myth was never a single fixed text for all Greeks. Still, the broad structure remains clear. Uranus's defeat is not the end of creation's first phase. It is the moment when new beings emerge from the consequences of that defeat. The cosmos becomes fuller through damage. That is why this section belongs immediately after the overthrow. The myth does not let a change in rule remain abstract. The sky's blood touches the earth. The sea receives the severed power of the former ruler. From those contacts come powers that will matter for the rest of Greek myth: avengers, tree nymphs, a goddess of desire, and in some traditions, the giants themselves. The world after Uranus is not just ruled differently. It is reconfigured by the aftermath of his fall. With Uranus gone, power does not settle into the later world of Zeus and the Olympians. In the older mythic sequence, rule passes to Cronus, one of the titans born to Gaia and Uranus. Hesiod presents him as the youngest and most calculating of the Titan children, and later Greek tradition often makes him the central figure of the generation before Zeus. His reign matters because it is the first order after the overthrow of the sky, but it is not peaceful or secure. Greek myth repeatedly shows that each divine generation inherits both the victory and the fear of the one before it. The Titans are not a perfectly uniform group in the surviving sources. In Hesiod, the name refers mainly to the children of Gaia and Uranus who belong to the older divine generation, while later writers sometimes use it more broadly for the whole pre-Olympian ruling family. What stays consistent is their place in the sequence. They stand between the earliest cosmic powers and the Olympian gods. They are closer to the beginning of the world than Zeus is, and that is why their rule is often imagined as older, rougher, and less settled. In later Greek thought, this earlier age could be treated as a kind of golden time. That is mostly a retrospective reading, however. The oldest sources are more concerned with succession than with nostalgia. Cronus comes to power because the divine line has already been broken once, and that break shapes everything that follows. Gaia had turned against Uranus, and Cronus had acted where the other sons could not. His rise follows a clear mythic pattern. Power passes through family conflict. The same pattern returns when Cronus learns that his own reign will not last. Greek myth does not treat this as an accident. It presents succession as a rule of the cosmos, as if divine authority can only exist by being challenged from within. In Hesiod's account, Cronus rules after the defeat of Uranus. The text does not dwell on administration or policy, because that is not the point. His reign is defined instead by what it cannot escape: the fear that one of his own children will do to him what he has done to his father. Later authors sometimes expand this age into a distant era of plenty or ease, but those are later additions. They reflect how Greeks in later periods imagined a lost past, not necessarily the oldest form of the myth. In the earlier sources, Cronus is less a benevolent king than the next holder of a dangerous title. The danger is built into the structure of the story. The violence against Uranus changes the cosmos, but it doesn't not solve the deeper problem of power. A ruler who rises by overthrowing his father now has reason to fear his own children. The myth therefore moves from one generational break to the next. Cronus's reign begins in control, but the same logic that lifted him up also makes his position unstable. The Titans dominate for a time, yet the prophecy over Cronus makes that dominance temporary. Even before the Olympians arrive, the future is already pressing against the present. Hesiod says Cronus learned from Gaia and Uranus that one of his children was destined to overthrow him. That warning is important, because it turns the next stage of the myth into a repeated pattern of succession. Cronus does not only fear a rival, he fears a return of the cosmic history he helped create. In response, he swallows each child born to Rhea, his sister and consort. The surviving account names Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon among those taken into him. The detail is severe, but the point is not spectacle. It is an attempt to stop the next generation from arriving. This gives Cronus a distinct place in Greek memory. He is not only a ruler, but also a guardian of an impossible order, trying to freeze the sequence of descent that brought him to power. The myth makes that effort self-defeating from the start. By devouring his children, Cronus preserves his reign for a while, but he also deepens the contradiction at its center. The children do not disappear. They become the hidden future of the cosmos. Rhea's later deception, when Zeus is concealed and Cronus is tricked with a wrapped stone, belongs to the same narrative logic. It is the return of the same problem in a new form, and it prepares Cronus's fall. Ancient Greek authors handled this material in different ways. Hesiod's Theogony is the clearest early surviving source for the sequence of Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus, and it presents the struggle as part of a larger genealogy of divine rule. Other poems, local traditions, and philosophical retellings sometimes soften Cronus or give him a more orderly, even civilizing age. In some later literature, he can be linked to the Golden Age, when humans lived without toil or violence. That image belongs more to later reflection than to the basic structure of the oldest poem. In the earliest surviving version, Cronus is remembered above all for what he does to preserve power and for the failure of that attempt. The consequences of his reign reach beyond his own family. His story helps explain why Greek myth treats Olympus as a secured but hard-won settlement rather than a natural beginning. Zeus does not inherit a calm universe. He inherits a history of disputed authority, broken succession, and divine fear. Cronus therefore stands at a turning point. He is the last major ruler before the Olympian order, and he confirms the lesson already set by the overthrow of Uranus. In Greek myth, power creates its own challenge. The ruler who rises by force must expect force to return. That is why Cronus matters in the creation sequence. He is not simply the king before Zeus. He is proof that the cosmos is still unfinished. The world has moved beyond the first confusion of earth and sky, but it has not yet reached stability. The prophecy that troubles Cronus follows the same pattern that already shaped his rise. Greek myth often treats power in families as something gained through force rather than peaceful inheritance. A father is displaced by a son, and then the son fears the same fate. In Hesiod's Theogony, that fear is not a vague emotion or a later moral lesson. It is a direct warning about succession, and it helps explain why divine rule is never secure. The prophecy about Cronus is not told in exactly the same form in every ancient source, but the core idea is stable. Cronus has taken his father's place, and now he learns that one of his own children will overthrow him. That shifts the conflict inward. It is no longer only a struggle between generations in the abstract. It becomes immediate and domestic. The ruler who gained power through violence now sees his own household as the source of his ruin. In Greek myth, that is not unusual. It is part of the structure of the world at this stage of the story. What makes the warning important is not only that it predicts rebellion, but that it shows how little stability exists before Zeus. The Titans may rule for a time, but their rule is already uncertain. The pattern begins with Uranus, who feared his children and tried to suppress them. It continues with Cronus, who is told that the same pattern will return against him. Greek myth is not simply listing family conflict, it is showing that authority itself is fragile when it is built on domination. Each generation inherits both power and the fear of losing it. Hesiod's version belongs to the oldest surviving Greek account of this sequence, and it matters that the poem presents the warning as part of a larger cosmological struggle, not as an isolated omen. In the Theogony, the succession of rulers is tied to the ordering of the world itself. The rise of Cronus follows the overthrow of Uranus, and that overthrow does not settle the universe. It creates a new tension at the center of divine life. The poem makes the fear understandable because the method that brought Cronus to power can now be used against him. He has learned that violent succession is effective, which also means it can be repeated. Later Greek and Roman authors often expanded this material, sometimes treating Cronus as a remote ruler of a gentler age. But in the older succession myth, his position is darker and sharper. He is not protected by kingship. He is trapped by the logic that created kingship among the gods in the first place. Once he has seized power from Uranus, replacement becomes part of his reign. The same violence that made him ruler now threatens to undo him. That is why the prophecy matters so much in the story. It is not a decorative warning. It is the mechanism that keeps the myth moving. This also helps explain why Greek cosmogony often feels less like a creation story in the modern sense and more like a series of transfers. The world does not simply appear complete. It passes through conflict, rule, fear, and replacement. Each ruler is temporary. Each order contains the seed of another. Cronus understands that his reign will not last forever, and the story makes clear that he is right to fear it. In that sense, the prophecy does more than foreshadow one event. It defines the political imagination of the myth. Cronus does not answer the prophecy by trying to outgrow it or dispute it. He answers it in the most direct way imaginable. As soon as his children are born, he swallows them. In Hesiod's Theogony, the order is clear. Hestia is taken first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, and then Poseidon. These are not minor figures added later. They are the major Olympian gods of Greek tradition, already present in seed form inside the oldest surviving cosmogonic poem. Their disappearance is central to the myth because it turns succession into containment. The next generation is not killed outright. It is held inside the body of the old ruler. That detail matters because Greek myth often uses bodily images to explain political and cosmic ideas. Cronus is not simply afraid in a vague sense. He is afraid of being replaced, and so he makes his own body into a prison. The act is grotesque, but it also follows the pattern set earlier in the myth. He overthrew his father by force. Now he tries to prevent the same pattern from reaching him. The result is a grim symmetry. Power is defended by repeating the same violence that created it. The surviving sources do not all tell the story in exactly the same way, but the Hesiodic version is the one most later readers know. In that account, Rhea gives birth, and Cronus immediately takes the child away. There is no long delay, no easing of the danger. The children are swallowed as they arrive, one after another, until the future rulers of Olympus are hidden within their father. Some later authors and local traditions varied the details, especially around the order of birth and the manner in which the children were concealed. But the basic structure remains the same. The mother is forced to watch her offspring disappear into the very power that should have protected them. Hesiod's sequence is important because it places the crisis in a family line already marked by rupture. Cronus had seized power from Uranus, and that earlier overthrow was itself violent and irreversible. In the poem, divine rule begins with conflict between generations, not harmony. Cronus therefore becomes a ruler who has learned the lesson of succession too well. He knows that sons can depose fathers, so he tries to stop the pattern before it can reach him. The myth makes his fear understandable, but not justified. It is the story of a king who mistakes prevention for safety. Rhea's grief shifts the story from fear to resistance. She is not merely a passive figure in the succession myth. In the older narrative, she becomes the one who sees a way through the dead end Cronus has created. The myth preserves a family crisis at the level of divine generation, but it also gives the crisis a concrete solution. Rhea cannot win by strength. She wins by substitution. When Zeus is born, she turns to Gaia and Uranus for help, and the plan that follows depends on deception, concealment, and a stand-in for the child. Before that rescue can happen, the swallowing itself has to be understood for what it is in Greek mythic language. It is not only a tale of cruelty, it is also an explanation for why the next order of gods is not immediately visible. The Olympians do not simply replace the Titans in a clean line. They exist under pressure, inside the old regime, before they can emerge into open rule. That hidden phase gives the myth its tension. The world is not yet ready for its next sovereign generation, and Cronus tries to keep it that way by making growth impossible. The detail also fits a wider pattern in Greek myth, where danger is often expressed through enclosure. A being may be trapped in a cave, hidden in a chest, shut inside a mountain, or here swallowed into a father's body. These images are not random embellishments. They help explain why divine or heroic power can remain present even when it has been blocked from public life. In Cronus's case, the swallowed children are still alive enough to matter. They are present as a concealed future, not a destroyed past. That is why the story can later turn on release rather than resurrection. In some later retellings, especially outside Hesiod, Cronus is softened into a figure associated with a lost golden age or a distant age of abundance. That later image is real in Greek tradition, but it should not be confused with the older succession narrative. In the succession myth, he is a king defined by threat. He has learned that rule can be lost, and he responds by trying to stop time at the point where his own authority remains intact. Swallowing his children is his attempt to freeze history. Even so, the myth is careful about consequence. Cronus's method does not solve the problem he fears, it only delays it. The children remain inside him, and that creates a hidden contradiction at the center of his reign. He rules the cosmos, but the future of the cosmos is already lodged within his own body. The arrangement cannot last forever, because the myth's logic depends on pressure building until it breaks. That is why the story turns so decisively when Zeus comes into the world. The hidden generation is not erased, it is waiting, and the myth never lets that effort succeed for long. The children are inside him, not gone. The world has been narrowed, not finished. Rhea's plan begins with the children. Cronus has already swallowed. In Hesiod's Theogony, he takes each child at birth, one after another, so none can replace him. By the time Rhea is pregnant again, the danger is no longer hypothetical. Cronus is not just a difficult husband or an anxious ruler. He is blocking succession by making sure his children never reach their own power. In Hesiod's genealogy, this is not a private family quarrel. It is a struggle over whether rule can continue at all, and whether the next generation will be allowed to exist. Rhea goes to Gaia and Uranus for help. That detail links her action to the oldest layer of the divine family. Gaia and Uranus belong to the first generation of cosmic powers, and in Hesiod they advise Rhea on how to save the next child. Their role matters because they stand outside the immediate conflict between Cronus and his children. They are not only sympathetic relatives, they are elder powers who understand what Cronus's behavior means for the order of the world. If every child is swallowed at birth, there is no transition, no inheritance, and no future generation to correct the present one. Instead of bringing the infant directly to Cronus, Rhea gives him a stone wrapped in cloth. Cronus swallows it as if it were another child. The deception works because he is following the same pattern he has used before, and this time that pattern is turned against him. Hesiod's version is stark and economical. It does not linger over the trick. The point is simply that Cronus expects a child and receives a stone. In later retellings, the stone can become more elaborate, sometimes tied to the object later shown at Delphi, but in the oldest narrative, the emphasis is on substitution and error. Cronus has been devouring what he thinks is the continuation of his own line. Now he consumes a substitute that does nothing to secure his power. The child Rhea saves is Zeus. Later tradition often adds detail, but the central point stays stable. One infant is removed from the reach of the father who has been consuming his own children. The others have been lost to Cronus's body. Zeus is kept outside that cycle entirely. He is hidden, and that concealment becomes the condition for everything that follows. In the logic of the myth, that is the first real break in Cronus's control. He cannot rule forever if one of his children survives beyond his grasp. The stone is small, but it carries the whole logic of the scene. It is not just a practical substitute, it proves that Cronus can be deceived. He has built his rule on the idea that nothing new will escape him, but he is tricked by an object that only appears to be what he expects. The myth does not present Rhea's victory as open confrontation. It presents it as careful substitution, a gap in Cronus's control. That gap matters more than force at this stage, because the story is still about survival, not yet overthrow. The swallowed stone also gives the episode a rough symmetry. Cronus uses swallowing as a way to preserve his authority, as if he can keep power intact by making the next generation part of himself. Rhea answers with an object that looks like an heir but contains nothing living. Other Greek versions place Zeus's concealment elsewhere. The best-known later tradition sets the scene in Crete, where Zeus is hidden in a cave, sometimes among the Curetes who make noise to cover the child's cries. That version is not the only one in antiquity, but it became one of the most familiar. It also fits a common Greek habit of tying divine stories to local landscapes. A cave in Crete could become more than a hiding place. It could also link a community to the god it claimed to shelter. In such retellings, the landscape itself becomes part of the memory of the god's survival. Still, the exact hiding place is less important than the break it creates in the myth sequence. Cronus has already shown that he will absorb the past to hold power. Rhea ensures that he cannot absorb the future in the same way. One child is withheld from him, and that survival changes the shape of the story. The next generation is no longer fully contained by the older one. The struggle has not ended, but it has shifted. Instead of a closed cycle of swallowing and disappearance, there is now a hidden remainder, something Cronus does not possess. That remainder will matter later when Zeus returns to challenge him. Ancient sources do not all treat the episode the same way. Some later retellings give more attention to Zeus's helpers, while others focus more heavily on Rhea's resolve. The broad structure, however, stays consistent. Rhea refuses the logic of complete loss. Gaia and Uranus make that refusal possible. Zeus is preserved outside the reach of the ruler who wanted to prevent change altogether. In some accounts, attendants or guardians help conceal the infant and keep the deception intact. Those variations do not erase the basic outline. They show how the story could be adapted to different local and literary interests while preserving the same reversal. This is why Rhea's secret plan matters in the larger creation tradition. The story has moved from swallowing to concealment. Cronus still rules, and his authority still appears complete, but it is no longer secure. He has failed to prevent succession entirely. One child has escaped him, and that is enough to keep the future open. The myth's larger sequence depends on that interruption. Zeus grows up in a part of the story that other gods are trying to keep hidden. That matters because Greek creation myth does not treat childhood as private or harmless. The fate of a child can determine the fate of the cosmos. In this generation, birth itself has become political. Cronus is not simply a father in the ordinary sense. He is a ruler trying to preserve his authority by controlling succession. Rhea's answer is to remove Zeus from that control before the pattern can repeat. This is not the first time the myth has tied power to family violence. Uranus had already been overthrown, and Cronus himself knew that a son could replace a father. In Hesiod's version, that memory is part of the problem. Cronus does not fear children in the abstract. He has been told that one of his own children will displace him, and he responds by swallowing each infant as soon as it is born. The act is extreme, but the logic fits the mythic sequence. Each generation tries to block the next one from becoming real. Rhea's decision to save Zeus is therefore more than maternal grief. It is the one interruption that can break the cycle. Most versions place Zeus's concealment in Crete, though the details vary. Hesiod's Theogony gives the broad sequence. Rhea delivers the child in secret and gives Cronus the stone in his place, while Zeus is hidden away to grow. Later Greek tradition expands that brief notice into a fuller upbringing, and some local Cretan traditions became important in that expansion. The cave setting is not random. Caves often mark hidden origin, a place between the visible world and older powers beneath it. Zeus is not raised in public under a royal household. He is kept out of sight, beyond the reach of the father who devours his heirs. The stone matters because it is a replacement, not an illusion in a modern sense. Cronus consumes what he believes is his child, and the myth preserves the irony without lingering on it. The child is saved by substitution, a method that fits the larger pattern of concealment. This is one of the few places where the narrative depends on deliberate deception that is protective rather than violent. Rhea makes a choice under pressure, and it works because Cronus is certain of his own control. The story gives him no warning that the logic of succession has already escaped him. Ancient writers do not agree on exactly who tended the infant. In some accounts, the curates guard him. They are sometimes described as armed attendants or youthful divine figures who beat shields or weapons together to drown out the child's cries. Other traditions give that role to the Corybantes or to local nymphs and attendants, depending on region and author. What stays consistent is the logic of concealment. Zeus survives because noise is used against notice. The guardians are not decorative figures around the cradle. They are part of the strategy that keeps Cronus from learning where the child is. In a myth shaped by succession struggle, even a cry can be dangerous. The Cretan setting also gave later Greeks a way to anchor the story in a place. Crete had its own cults and legends, and it became closely associated with Zeus's early life. That does not mean the myth should be treated as a historical claim in the modern sense. It means the story was remembered in a landscape. A cave on Crete could be identified as the place where the god was reared, and local tradition could turn that location into evidence of divine presence. Greek myth often works this way. It links cosmic beginnings to specific sites, making the world itself carry the memory of what came before human history. Different authors and communities used that Cretan setting in slightly different ways. Some emphasized Mount Ida, while others focused more on the ritual noise of the guardians than on exact geography. There are also local claims that Zeus's infancy belonged to a particular cave, grove, or shrine, depending on where the tradition was told. That variety matters because it shows how a brief mythic episode could support more than one cultic memory. The story did not stay abstract. It was attached to places where people made offerings, told local origin stories, and recognized Zeus as a god with a beginning that could still be remembered. The purpose of Zeus's hidden childhood is simple, but the implications are larger. He is preserved not just as a son, but as the possibility of reversal. Cronus's power depends on preventing replacement. Rhea's success depends on creating one exception to that rule. Zeus therefore grows in a condition that mirrors his future role. He is concealed now so that later he can emerge in full force. The myth keeps him out of sight long enough for him to become the instrument of change. Some later retellings add details about Zeus's nourishment. The nymph Amalthea sometimes appears as a foster figure, and in some traditions the infant is raised with divine or semi-divine care rather than by his mother alone. There are also stories of the goat and the horn of plenty attached to his early life, though those belong to a wider mythic afterlife around Zeus, rather than to a single fixed account of his infancy. The important point is that the child is not left exposed. Greek tradition repeatedly insists that his survival required guardianship. The future king of the gods is kept alive by a network of concealment, substitution, and protection. These additions are not random embellishments. They help explain how Zeus can later become associated with nurture as well as rule. The goat Amalthea, for example, appears in later tradition as a source of milk and abundance, and the horn of plenty is linked to prosperity that flows from divine favor. That is a different kind of power from Cronus's fearful grip. One depends on possession and prevention, the other depends on growth, sustenance, and eventual distribution. Even when the sources do not agree on the exact shape of the legend, they preserve a contrast that matters for the larger myth. The child hidden from a devouring father becomes the god associated with order after chaos, not because he is born stronger, but because he is kept alive until strength can matter. That pattern also helps explain why this episode is so central to the creation myth as a whole. The old order tried to make itself permanent by swallowing what came after it. The new order survives by being hidden until it can act openly. The story is not yet at open conflict, but the balance has already shifted. Zeus is alive, he is growing. The ruler who meant to stop succession has already failed once, and the failure has been buried in a cave rather than ended. Zeus's return begins with the release of the children Cronus had swallowed. In Hesiod's best-known account, Metis, the goddess of intelligence and craft, helps bring about that reversal. Cronus is made to disgorge the children he had taken into himself in the hope of preventing their rise. Other traditions keep the same basic movement but change the means. A potion may be prepared, a trick may be used, or another divine helper may intervene. The method is not fixed across all sources, but the outcome is consistent. What Cronus tried to keep hidden is brought back into the light. That moment is the turning point in the succession myth. Cronus had treated swallowing his children as a way to stop replacement. Greek myth refuses that logic. The children do not disappear. They remain alive, suspended inside his power until Zeus is able to reverse the act. The older generation still has control for a time, but the future is no longer trapped. The story is not simply about rescue in a personal sense. It is about restoring a blocked order. The line of succession has been delayed, not erased. In Hesiod, the siblings Zeus, Phres are the gods who will later belong to the Olympian order: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Their release makes the coming struggle possible. Zeus is no longer just a hidden survivor in Crete. He becomes the center of a restored family, and soon enough, a coalition. The family that Cronus had broken apart is visible again, and that visibility changes everything. The gods can now act together, even if later traditions still describe tensions among them. Hesiod's poem does not present this as a gentle reunion. It is the practical precondition for a new regime. Once the children are brought back, their shared position gives them a place from which to resist their father. The symbolic force of this scene is plain. Cronus had tried to make himself a barrier between generations. Zeus reverses that act and restores the principle that each reign is temporary. Power may be delayed, concealed, or misused, but it cannot permanently prevent what comes after it. Greek myth returns to that idea often. The return of Zeus makes it concrete in narrative form. What was hidden becomes recoverable, and what had been blocked begins to move again. This is one reason the story mattered beyond its own plot. It could be read as a model for political succession, for household continuity, and for the idea that a ruler who tries to freeze time will eventually fail. Some later tellings make the rescue more elaborate. Zeus may not perform every part of it alone. Metis may prepare the means by which Cronus is deceived, or another divine helper may be involved. In some versions, a drug or a crafted plan replaces the simpler image of direct force. These variations matter because they show how flexible Greek myth could be in its treatment of foundational events. The core claim remains stable. Zeus comes back from concealment, and his brothers and sisters are brought out of Cronus's power. Later mythographers and poets often kept the outcome while adjusting the method, which is typical of a tradition transmitted through many cities, dialects, and literary settings. The details shift. The structure does not. Once the siblings are restored, Zeus begins to gather allies for the larger struggle ahead. In the early accounts, the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchyres are usually on his side, though the sequence is not always presented in the same way from one source to another. This is not a minor detail. The war that follows is not won by strength alone. It depends on recruitment, access to weapons, and the ability to draw older beings into a new cause. Zeus's return is therefore not only a family event, it is the political beginning of a new alliance. The myth moves from hidden endurance to organized resistance, and that transition is what gives the story its momentum. The Cyclopes matter because they help arm Zeus and his brothers. In Hesiod, they later forge the thunderbolt, the weapon most closely associated with Zeus's rule. That means the return of the hidden generation is already tied to the tools of victory. Zeus does not simply survive his father's attempt to contain him. He comes back with the means to challenge the power that had dominated before him. The story is moving toward open conflict, but it does so by stressing preparation first. The thunderbolt is not introduced as a random magical flourish. It belongs to the logic of succession. The new ruler must receive the instrument that marks him as distinct from those who came before. The Hecatonchyres serve a similar purpose in the myth. Their enormous strength is not just there for scale. They represent a force the older regime could not control and the new regime can enlist. Their presence suggests that the cosmos includes powers greater than the divided family itself. Whoever can bring those powers to their side gains an advantage. In that sense, the return of Zeus is also the moment when alliance begins to matter as much as inheritance. The old order had tried to preserve itself by swallowing its own future. The new order will succeed by opening itself to outside aid. At this stage, the story also changes in tone. Before Zeus acts, the central image is concealment. The child is hidden, the threat is hidden, and the father's violence is folded inward. Once Zeus frees his siblings, the conflict opens outward. It can no longer remain inside a family body. It must become a war between orders. That is one reason the succession myth remains so important in Greek tradition. It does more than explain who came first. It shows how hidden tension becomes public history. The family drama turns into cosmic politics, and the private fear of replacement becomes a struggle that affects the whole divine world. Later authors and local traditions often reshape the details to suit different emphases. Some focus on the rescue itself, others give more weight to cleverness, still others stress the allies who follow. But the broad movement remains the same across the surviving versions. Zeus is preserved, Zeus returns, Zeus restores his siblings, and Zeus gathers support. The family Cronus tried to compress into silence is assembled again, and with that reassembly his control begins to fail in earnest. In some tellings, the emphasis falls on Metis because intelligence rather than force is what breaks the deadlock. In others, the key point is simply that Cronus can be deceived, which already marks a change in the balance of power. The ruler who once seemed secure is shown to be vulnerable to planning. By the time the siblings are brought back, the story has crossed a threshold. The younger gods are no longer trapped inside the father who feared them. They are alive, visible, and in motion. That is what makes the next stage inevitable. The hidden generation has been restored, and the struggle for power is no longer waiting in the background. It is about to begin openly. The return of Zeus does not finish the succession myth, but it changes its direction. The war that follows is called the Titanomachy in later Greek tradition, though the surviving sources do not preserve a single fixed account of every battle. What they do preserve is the larger pattern. Zeus stands with the younger generation of gods, while the older divine order resists him. The conflict is not only personal, it is a struggle over who will control the universe and what kind of rule will define it. In Hesiod's Theogony, the Titans are the older gods born from Gaia and Uranus, and Cronus is their leader before Zeus. That poem is the fullest early source for the succession sequence, even if it does not read like a military chronicle. It presents the conflict as part of a broader cosmic change that begins long before open war. Uranus had tried to prevent succession by hiding his children, and Cronus later repeated the pattern by swallowing his own offspring. Zeus reverses that history. The story moves from secrecy to open violence, and from hidden domination to direct contest. The younger gods do not win by strength alone. Zeus needs allies who can change the scale of the war. That is where the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires matter. In Hesiod, Zeus frees the Cyclopes and the hundred-handed ones from confinement, and they repay him with decisive help. The Cyclopes forge the thunderbolt, the weapon most closely associated with Zeus in later myth. In the surviving poetry, their craft gives Zeus an instrument that is both symbolic and practical, a divine weapon that marks him as ruler of sky and storm. The Hecatonchires, with their immense strength and many hands, throw massive stones and overwhelm the enemy line. Their role is not decorative. They give Zeus a kind of force Cronus never expected his children to command. Different traditions place some details differently. Later poets and mythographers sometimes expand the war into a longer campaign, and local versions vary in how they describe Zeus's allies. Some accounts include the gods who later become Olympians as active participants, while others focus almost entirely on Zeus, the Cyclopes, and the Hecatonchires. In some tellings, the battle lasts for a long time, with neither side able to secure a quick victory. But the central structure remains stable. Zeus gains support from powers that had been suppressed by the older regime. The war is therefore not only a struggle against the Titans, it is also a release of hidden forces the old order could not contain. That extended conflict helps explain why the Titanomachy became such a useful mythic image in Greek literature. It is a story about resistance, stalemate, and finally the collapse of an older authority that seemed fixed. The Titans are not defeated because they are weak. They are defeated because the cosmic balance has changed and Zeus now commands the powers that can break the deadlock. The myth gives that change a form that can be remembered, not a quiet transfer of power, but a struggle in which the old world is forced back by a force it had tried to keep contained. Hesiod does not give a full military map of the war, but he makes clear that the outcome is decisive. The Titans are overcome and cast down. Later tradition often places them in Tartarus, the deep region associated with confinement and separation from the ordered world. Tartarus matters because it is not just a prison in the ordinary sense. In Greek cosmology, it marks a boundary at the edge of what can be ruled in an ordered way. The old sovereigns are removed from active power, and their defeat makes room for a new structure of rule. The story ends with division, containment, and a new arrangement of divine authority. The victory of Zeus also confirms the larger pattern already established in the succession myths. Uranus is displaced by Cronus. Cronus is displaced by Zeus. Each generation fears the one that follows, and each attempt to block succession only delays the outcome. The Titanomachy is the moment when that cycle ends in a more stable form. Zeus does not simply seize power. He becomes the ruler who will organize power. In later Greek thought that matters because Zeus is not only stronger than the others, he is the one who can establish measure, share rule among the gods, and hold the universe together after the violence of succession. That is why the war leads directly into a new cosmic order. Once the Titans are subdued, there is no longer a rival generation strong enough to challenge Zeus openly. The universe can now be divided and governed. The victory is not just a military ending. Once Zeus has won the war, Greek myth turns from conflict to division. The question is no longer who rules, but how rule can be made stable. In the clearest Hesiodic version, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades are the three great brothers who share the victory. They do not receive equal domains. Zeus takes the sky and highest authority, Poseidon receives the sea, Hades rules the underworld, the realm of the dead. The earth itself remains a shared surface, but the major spheres of existence now have distinct masters. This division is not shown as a casual agreement among equals, it follows an overthrow. The world has moved through a series of contested successions, and the new order has to solve a problem the older one could not. If Uranus feared his children and Cronus feared his own, Zeus establishes a system in which power is no longer trapped in one generation of jealous fathers. The universe becomes legible through office and region. Sky, sea, and underworld are separated into recognizable realms, each with its own authority. The myth does more than tell a family story. It explains why the cosmos can be imagined as divided without being broken apart. Hesiod's account is especially important because it gives the division a political shape. Zeus is not merely stronger than his brothers, he becomes the king of gods in the sense that his sphere is highest and most comprehensive. Poseidon's authority is large, but bounded by the sea. Hades' authority is real, but it lies below the world of the living. That arrangement helps explain why later Greek religion could speak of an Olympian order while still honoring gods with different functions. Not every divine power disappears into Zeus's rule. Instead, the cosmos is organized so that major powers fit within a larger hierarchy. The system preserves distinction without returning to chaos. In some later retellings, the allotment is told as if the brothers drew lots. That version softens the image of conquest and gives the division the appearance of a formal settlement. The underlying point is the same. The old war ends with a stable distribution of sovereignty. Greek audiences could recognize the logic immediately. Once the great struggle is over, the world must be parceled out in a way that prevents another total collapse. Myth gives that settlement a divine ancestry. The lot, where it appears, also suggests a principle familiar in Greek life, where chance or divine sanction could confirm a division that no one brother could simply claim by force alone. Even then, the order remains the result of victory. The drawing of lots does not erase the war that made the division possible. Poseidon's portion also shows how Greek myth linked geography to divine order. The sea was not just a place of travel or danger, it was a sphere with a godly ruler, and that ruler belonged to the same family that ruled the sky. This mattered because the Greek world depended on the sea for movement, exchange, and contact between communities. A divine master of the sea made that uncertain element intelligible. Sailors, traders, and coastal cities could imagine themselves living under a power that was both kin to Olympus and separate from it. Hades, by contrast, does not stand for evil in the later moral sense. He represents a necessary boundary, the hidden domain where the dead go and from which they do not return. The separation of his realm from Zeus's sky makes the cosmos easier to imagine as a whole. Life above, movement across the sea, and death below each have a place. That arrangement also has a ritual dimension. Greek religion was not built around a single doctrine of salvation or condemnation. It depended on distinctions of place, function, and obligation. The dead belonged elsewhere. Offerings for the dead, chthonic rites, and the use of underworld deities in local cult all reflect a world in which Hades' realm was not abstract, but present in religious practice. Zeus' sky remained the place of oaths, kingship, and civic protection. Poseidon could be invoked by sailors, horse breeders, and communities that lived close to the sea. The threefold division made it possible to address different powers without collapsing them into one another. This does not mean the world becomes simple. Even after the division, Greek myth keeps older tensions alive. Zeus remains the chief ruler, but he is not the only god who matters. Poseidon can still challenge, resist, or complicate his brother's plans in later tradition. Hades remains remote and powerful in his own sphere. The point is not that all divine conflict ends forever. The point is that conflict no longer threatens to undo the structure of the cosmos itself. The great domains have been defined. The same myths that preserve the settlement also preserve traces of strain within it, which is one reason the Olympian order feels stable without ever becoming static. That is why this moment matters in the broader creation story. Greek myth does not move straight from nothing to order in one step. It passes through generations, struggles, and violent shifts of authority before arriving at a workable universe. The Titanomachy removes the old ruling generation. The division among Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades turns victory into structure. Heaven, sea, and underworld are no longer only ideas waiting to be named. They are parts of a settled divine map. The version of Greek creation preserved by Hesiod is the best known, but it was never the only one. Ancient audiences knew that different communities, poets, and religious circles preserved different beginnings. Some accounts overlap in broad outline, yet they do not agree on which powers came first, how many generations preceded Zeus, or whether the earliest ordering principle was earth, night, time, desire, or something less personal than a god. One major alternative is the Orphic tradition, a group of later religious poetic accounts associated with the name of Orpheus. These stories survive in fragments, summaries, and much later quotations, so they are harder to reconstruct than Hesiod. Even so, they show a different way of imagining the start of the cosmos. In some Orphic versions, night is an ancient and foundational power, older in status than the family line Hesiod begins with. In others, time stands near the beginning, not as a god in the later Olympian sense, but as a primordial ordering force. The sequence of births can change as well. Rather than moving directly from chaos to Gaia and then to the succession of Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus, Orphic material often presents a more layered unfolding, with cosmic egg imagery, divine beings emerging in symbolic forms, and a stronger emphasis on generation and transformation. That difference matters. Hesiod's Theogony is interested in ancestry, conflict, and sovereignty. The Orphic tradition often gives more attention to sacred origin, ritual, and the hidden structure of the world. In some Orphic accounts, the cosmos is not simply born from family struggle. It is disclosed through divine manifestations that can include night, time, necessity, or a world egg from which a new order emerges. The evidence is scattered, and later writers sometimes describe Orphic belief in broad strokes without preserving a single fixed text. What can be said with confidence is that Orphic cosmogonies did not simply repeat Hesiod. They reimagined the beginning in ways that could support different religious ideas, especially ideas tied to purification, the soul, and hidden sacred knowledge. In that setting, origin stories were not only about the past, they also explained why certain rites mattered, why some forms of life were considered purer than others, and why knowledge of the divine was often treated as guarded rather than public. Pherecydes of Syros offers another early variation. He is usually placed in the 6th century BCE, and his work survives only in fragments and later reports. Even so, he appears to have written a prose cosmogony that stands apart from both epic genealogy and later philosophical system building. In the surviving material and Testimonia, Pherecydes presents a world shaped by divine figures such as Zeus, usually identified with Zeus, and by powers named among them as Cronus, Earth, and possibly another principle associated with cosmic order. His account is not easy to reduce to a single outline because the evidence is incomplete, but it shows that Greek thinkers were already experimenting with ways to explain origins outside the standard poetic line from Hesiod. He seems to have worked at the boundary between myth and early philosophy, preserving divine beings while arranging them in a more speculative order. That makes him important because he shows a transitional stage in Greek thought, when a cosmogony could still be told with divine personalities, but also be shaped by reflection on sequence, structure, and the relation between visible world and hidden cause. Local traditions could diverge just as strongly. Greek religion was not centralized, and cities often maintained stories that linked their own sacred places to the start of the world. In some regions, Earth had special local honors. In others, a place, a shrine, or a mountain was woven into the oldest genealogy. These stories were not always competing in a formal sense. Often they answered different questions. A local cosmogony might explain why a sanctuary belonged to a certain god, why a landform was sacred, or why a city claimed special closeness to a divine ancestor. A regional account could also preserve older names and older divine functions that were later absorbed into broader myth. Because of that, the Greek creation story is better understood as a family of related narratives than as one closed system. The same god could be treated differently from one locality to another. A power that is abstract in one poem might be more personal in a cult context. A landscape feature could become a remembered witness to divine birth, even when another region told the beginning in entirely different terms. Another variation concerns the role of night. In Hesiod, night is a descendant of chaos, one among several early powers. In some later or alternative traditions, however, night becomes much more central. She can stand at the beginning as a source of further beings or as a primal presence from which the cosmos takes shape. This does not mean the Greeks believed one single thing about night. It means that certain poets and theologians treated her as a fitting image for hidden beginnings, for things present before clear distinctions were made. The same is true of time in the broader tradition. When Cronus appears in cosmogonic roles, he is not always the same as the Titan Cronus, even though later writers sometimes blur the names. Cronus as time belongs to a more abstract way of thinking, and that distinction needs to be kept clear. One is a mythic ruler in the Titan succession, the other is a primordial principle in some speculative theogonies. In Greek sources, the overlap of names can be misleading, and later interpretation sometimes creates confusion that the older evidence does not require. These variations show that Greek creation myth was not static. It developed across centuries and settings. A poet could inherit Hesiod's genealogy and adapt it. A mystery tradition could place greater emphasis on night or time. A local cult could preserve a sacred origin tied to its own landscape. Later philosophers could reuse mythic language while shifting it toward argument and explanation. What remains constant is not a single sequence of births, but the attempt to say how a world of separate powers, regions, and generations came to be. That attempt also reflects changes in Greek intellectual life. As poetry, ritual, and speculative thought moved in and out of contact, the same broad mythic vocabulary could support very different aims. One version might preserve ancestral order, another might explain initiation, another might try to describe a more universal structure behind all divine names. For that reason, the surviving stories should not be treated as errors in relation to one original version. They are evidence of a living mythic culture. Hesiod provides the clearest and most influential framework, but Orphic cosmogonies, the fragments of Pherecydes, And the many local traditions around Greece show that people kept returning to the same basic question and answering it in different ways. Some placed night at the origin, some privileged time, some imagined a cosmic egg, some retained a family history of divine generations. The result is not confusion so much as variety within a shared religious language. Each tradition selected a different starting point because each wanted to explain something slightly different about the world, its sacred order, its hidden unity, its divisions, or the authority of a particular god or cult. Taken together, these sources make the origin story look less like a single line and more like a set of related attempts to define the first conditions of the world. That is what makes Greek creation myth so enduring. It can present Earth as a goddess, sky as a father, time as an ordering power, or night as a hidden beginning, depending on the tradition. The clearest place to begin is with Hesiod, because his Theogony is the fullest early Greek account of the god's origins that survives in continuous form. It was not the only cosmogony in circulation, but it became the most influential. In that poem, creation is not a single event. It is a sequence of births, separations, conflicts and arrangements, moving from the first conditions of the world toward a structured divine order. For many later Greeks, and for modern readers as well, Hesiod gave the basic outline that others could follow, revise, or argue against. He also established a style of explanation, not abstract theory, but divine family history, where the shape of the cosmos is understood through generations and succession. That matters because most of what we know about Greek creation myth survives in pieces. Some texts are complete enough to read on their own, others survive only in fragments quoted by later authors, preserved on papyrus or summarized by philosophers and mythographers centuries after the fact. The record is uneven. A tradition may be visible in one line of a poem, a passing reference in a scholium, or a hostile remark from a later writer who is trying to reject it. We can often say that a version existed. We cannot always say exactly how widely it was known or what its earliest form looked like. Even when a source is later than the material it preserves, it can still be valuable if it clearly identifies the tradition it is reporting. But the distance between the surviving testimony and the original composition always matters. Hesiod's Theogony remains central because it is early, detailed, and ordered. It places the generation of the gods within a family history that leads from primordial realities to Zeus's rule. But even there, Hesiod is not working in isolation. His poem belongs to an oral and poetic world in which divine genealogy was already meaningful. Epic tradition, including the broader archaic Greek epic milieu, helped shape the language of ancestry, kingship, and divine conflict. Lyric poets also preserve scattered traces of early mythic thinking, though rarely in the extended narrative form that Hesiod gives it. Their value lies less in providing a full creation story than in showing which names, relationships, and divine functions were familiar enough to be used without explanation. That is one reason the Theogony was so durable. It did not invent the entire mythic language of beginnings, but it gathered and organized material that listeners were likely to recognize from other settings. The poem also reflects a world in which order had to be won and maintained. Divine succession is not presented as smooth continuity. Power changes hands. Some gods are displaced. Others are assigned roles. Zeus's rule is not simply assumed. It emerges after earlier generations and after a series of conflicts that give the cosmos its final arrangement. For later Greek audiences, that pattern mattered. It offered a mythic way to think about authority itself, what it means for one figure to become supreme, how disorder gives way to structure, and why hierarchy requires both inheritance and force. In that sense, the poem is not just a list of gods. It is a model of how the world becomes organized. Philosophical writers and pre-Socratic thinkers add another layer. They are not usually retelling myth for its own sake. More often, they are redefining the world in terms of elements, principles, or causes. Still, their surviving fragments matter because they show how mythic material could be reinterpreted. In some cases, a philosopher preserves a traditional genealogy only to replace it with a more rational account. In other cases, the old names remain, but the meaning changes. Night, time, necessity, or the cosmic egg can appear in descriptions that are partly mythic and partly speculative. Those texts do not erase myth. They show how strongly it continued to shape Greek attempts to explain beginnings. A thinker may disagree with poetic tradition and still borrow its vocabulary because the old language remained powerful enough to frame new ideas. Orphic materials are especially important, but also especially difficult. The Orphic cosmogonies survive in a scattered and complicated state, with versions transmitted by later authors and not always agreeing with one another. Some place night at the beginning, some feature time as a prime mover. Some describe a cosmic egg from which the world emerges. These accounts are often later than Hesiod, and they belong to ritual and religious contexts that were not identical with mainstream civic cult. Because of that, they should not be treated as a single unified system. Orphic is a useful label, but it covers a range of traditions that were probably not fixed in one canonical form. What survives is enough to show that Greek mythic thought could imagine creation in ways very different from the family sequence of the Theogony. It could also imagine creation as a revelation known through ritual expertise rather than as a public epic inheritance. Some of the later Orphic testimonies are themselves filters, not direct witnesses. A Christian writer, a Neoplatonist, or a mythographer may preserve an Orphic line while interpreting it through a different intellectual framework. That does not make the evidence useless. It means the reader has to notice what kind of source is speaking. A quotation is not the same as a summary, and a summary is not the same as an original poem. When scholars reconstruct Orphic cosmogony, they are piecing together a tradition that was probably fluid even in antiquity, then further shaped by later transmission. The uncertainty is part of the subject. Aristides of Syros belongs in that same broad conversation, though only in fragments and reports. Ancient testimony suggests that he offered a cosmological account in which divine figures and cosmic ordering were arranged in a distinctive sequence. The surviving evidence is thin, and later summaries are not always easy to interpret. That limitation is important. Aristides is often mentioned because he stands near the boundary between mythic genealogy and early philosophy, but much of his work is reconstructed from indirect evidence. He is useful less as a source for a single fixed story than as proof that early Greek authors were experimenting with origin narratives in several forms at once. His importance lies in the movement of thought as much as in any one detail. The attempt to describe beginnings in a way that still used divine names, but also moved toward explanation. Local traditions matter too, even when they never became famous outside a particular region or sanctuary. Greek religion was not centralized, so a city, sanctuary, or poetic line could preserve its own way of telling where the gods and the world came from. In one place, a figure like Night might carry more weight. In another, a land-based divine ancestry might be emphasized. Sometimes a local tradition survives only because a later writer notes that the people of such and such place say this. Those notices are brief, but they show that creation myth was not a single fixed inheritance. It was part of regional religious memory, flexible enough to support local identity. A local origin story could also explain why a god was worshipped in a particular place or why a sanctuary claimed special antiquity. In that sense, cosmogony was not only about the universe as a whole, it could also serve the needs of a city, a cult, or a priestly tradition. That flexibility helps explain why surviving Greek origin stories can look so different while still belonging to the same culture. Some accounts begin with a void or an opening gap. Others begin with earth, night, or time. Some are concerned mainly with divine genealogy. Others move toward philosophy and the structure of nature. The key point is not that one version is correct and the others are distortions. The key point is that Greek writers preserved several ways of thinking about the beginning, and those ways survived through different kinds of evidence. The differences are not accidental noise. They are part of the history of the myths themselves. So when we ask where Greek creation myths come from, the answer is not one book or one priestly tradition. It is a layered record. Hesiod gives the most complete early framework. Fragments of epic and lyric preserve older names and inherited language. Orphic texts open another path, often more mystical and more speculative. Philosophers and prose writers show how those myths were reworked into explanation. Local cult traditions keep the whole subject grounded in actual communities. These myths were never only about the distant past. For Greek writers and worshippers, they explained why the world has hierarchy, why family becomes conflict, and why authority remains fragile. A creation story was also a story about succession, about power passing from one generation to the next, and about what happens when that transfer is resisted. In Hesiod especially, the first history of the gods is also a history of struggle. One ruler follows another. The older order tries to hold on. The younger order rises in response. That pattern becomes one of the main structures of Greek cosmology. That is why creation myths so often move through a family line. Earth produces sky. Sky resists his children. Cronus overthrows his father and is later overthrown in turn. Zeus becomes king only after the older generation is broken. This is not just divine genealogy. It is a mythic model for political change. Greek audiences knew that kings changed, cities changed, and households changed. The poems turn that uncertainty into cosmic history. Power passes on, but rarely peacefully. The old ruler fears the new one, and the new one must prove himself before order can settle. The stories are also about fertility, but not in a narrow sense. Fertility in Greek myth means the world's capacity to bring forth more life, more forms, more places, and more powers. Gaia produces mountains, sea, sky, and children without needing an outside creator. In some traditions, the first beings emerge through generation. In others, they arise more abstractly, as if the cosmos itself were opening into structure. Either way, the world is not inert matter. It is active, generative, and crowded with ancestry. Divine family trees are one way the Greeks express that abundance. A mountain can be a child of earth. A river can have a divine parent. A god can stand for a force that keeps producing new things. Later Greek thinkers, especially philosophers and allegorists, could read these genealogies as attempts to map visible features of the world onto a sacred order of descent. That fertility is never separated from danger. The same power that makes life possible can also become excessive. Uranus tries to suppress his children, Cronus devours his own. These acts belong to the same symbolic pattern. Greek myth often treats violence as a distorted form of generation, as if the urge to control life becomes destructive when it refuses limits. The stories do not present family violence as admirable, they present it as foundational and costly. The cosmos comes into order, but only after repeated acts of harm. The sky is separated from the earth. The children are released, the generations no longer collapse into one another. Order is achieved, but it carries the memory of injury. In Hesiod's Theogony, that memory remains embedded in the structure of the poem itself, because every new regime carries the burden of the one it displaced. This is one reason the myths mattered so much to Greek ideas of lawful order. The universe in these stories is not random. It has rulers, domains, boundaries, and inherited powers. Zeus does not simply win by force. His rule becomes meaningful because it ends a period of instability and division. The cosmic structure that follows has recognizable parts: heaven above, sea around, underworld below, and the human world in between. That structure makes the world intelligible. It gives Greeks a way to imagine pattern behind what they see, even when that pattern was born through conflict. The older gods are not erased, but assigned places. Their continued presence matters, because Greek religion often worked through coexistence rather than replacement. A defeated power could still remain active in ritual memory, local cult, or poetic illusion. Different traditions gave different emphasis to that pattern. In some versions, the central concern is ancestry and legitimacy. In others, it is the movement from undifferentiated beginning to ordered nature. Philosophical writers later treated these stories as rough attempts to explain how the world took shape. In that reading, chaos, earth, and time are not only divine names. They are ways of naming stages or conditions of reality. But the older poetic tradition does not reduce them to concepts. It keeps them personal and relational. Earth is a goddess, sky is a god. Their conflict is family conflict, but it also mirrors the structure of the world. The myth works precisely because it can move between those levels. The Greeks did not need one final explanation for this to be meaningful. A myth could be religious, explanatory, and symbolic at once. It could speak about the earth's fertility, the danger of inherited power, the necessity of limits, and the uneasy path from disorder to stable rule. It could also preserve a cultural warning. No rule lasts forever, no generation can fully trap the next, and no order is permanent without some account of where it came from. That warning had obvious force in a world of competing aristocratic houses, shifting civic institutions, and local cults that preserved older forms even as new political arrangements emerged. Creation myth gave those changes a language of precedent. Seen this way, Greek creation myth is not only a story of what came first, it is a meditation on power, nature, and the cost of making a world livable. The cosmic family rises out of uncertainty, and every step toward order leaves traces of the struggle that made it possible. That is why these stories endured. They did not merely answer where the gods came from. Greek creation myths did not stay confined to cosmic beginnings. They also lived in sanctuaries, festivals, hymns, and local traditions, where Greeks honored earth, sky, and the Olympian gods in practical and specific ways. These stories helped explain why a place belonged to a god, why a ritual was performed, or why a community believed its landscape had divine ancestry. Myth was part of how Greeks understood the world they inhabited. The link between myth and cult is clearest with Gaia. In the poems, she is a primordial being, but she was also honored in worship, sometimes under local forms and names tied to fertility, the ground of the city, or the safety of the home. In some places, Earth was approached as a maternal power whose favor supported crops, childbirth, and community continuity. Local religion varied widely, so not every cult of Earth looked the same. Still, the larger pattern is clear. A cosmogonic figure could also be a cult figure. The goddess who stands at the beginning of the world could also receive offerings in ordinary civic life. Sanctity in Greek religion was often attached to places, tasks, and seasons, not only to abstract theology. A field, a threshold, a spring, or a civic hearth could all carry divine significance, and Earth belonged naturally to that network. Sky is less prominent as a cult figure than Earth, and that difference matters. Uranus belongs mainly to mythic genealogy, where he functions as an ancestral divine power rather than a major object of worship. That contrast shows something important about Greek religion. Not every being in a creation myth became a recipient of sacrifice or festival. Some names remained primarily narrative, others were absorbed into cult in limited or local ways. The myths preserved a family tree of the cosmos, but worship selected from that tree according to religious need, local habit, and inherited tradition. A god could matter greatly in poetry without having a large public cult, and a cult could be old and important without being central in the surviving myths. Literary prominence and ritual prominence were not the same thing. The Olympians were different because they stood at the center of both story and ritual. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, and others were not only descendants in succession myths. They were among the gods most often honored across the Greek world, each with festivals, sacrifices, and local forms of devotion. The myth of Zeus's rise helped explain why he was king of the gods, but his worship did not depend on that narrative alone. Greeks sacrificed to Zeus because he guarded kingship, justice, guest friendship, weather, and oaths. Poseidon mattered as a god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. Demeter was closely tied to grain and agriculture. Hera held a place in marriage and civic continuity. Creation stories gave these gods ancestry, but cult gave them daily presence in public worship, household observance, and the offerings made for protection, abundance, or legitimacy. Myth explained why the gods were there, ritual kept them involved in human life. That is why the difference between mythic genealogy and worship should stay clear. A story about who was born from whom does not always describe how people prayed. Greek genealogies often made divine relationships more orderly than the ritual record would suggest. They arranged powers into a family, but local religion could treat the same powers as separate, overlapping, or independent. A sanctuary did not need a perfect cosmic family tree to function. A festival could honor a god for a specific role without explaining that god's place in every cosmogonic sequence. In practice, Greeks moved between these levels without forcing one to fully explain the other. A hymn might invoke a god in grand mythic language, while the rite focused on a narrower concern, the success of a voyage, the protection of a boundary, the ripening of grain, or the health of a city. Festival life made that flexibility visible. Many rites marked seasons, harvests, civic identity, or transitions in human life, and creation myths could remain in the background as a way of explaining why the world had order at all. In agricultural settings, myths of earth and fertility made the land feel active and holy. In civic settings, stories about Zeus or Athena could reinforce the legitimacy of laws and institutions. In mystery traditions, especially where Demeter and Persephone were central, the mythic language of loss, return, and renewed fertility gave ritual meaning a deeper structure. The surviving evidence is uneven, and not every ritual can be tied directly to a creation myth, but the broader pattern is consistent. Myth and worship were interwoven, even when they did not match perfectly. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example, show how a divine story could organize ritual secrecy, seasonal expectation, and hope for continuity beyond ordinary life, while still remaining rooted in agricultural realities. Local cults also preserved older layers of belief that literary sources only partly reflect. A place might honor a god in a form that felt ancient to worshippers, even if surviving poems told that figure's story differently. Some sanctuaries of Earth may preserve older chthonic or fertility associations, later folded into broader Olympian religion. Other regions retained especially strong local traditions about one god's birth, one shrine's origin, or one ancestral power of the land. Greek religion was not a single uniform system. It was a network of communities, each with its own memory. Creation myth could never be reduced to one neat doctrine. The stories traveled, but they settled differently in different places. A god might be linked above all to a hill, a grove, a burial ground, a mountain, or a river, depending on local history and practice. The mythic figure remained recognizable, but the cultic reality was shaped by place. That is also why these stories remained useful for so many centuries. They did not just tell Greeks where the gods came from, they connected divine origin to present practice. If Earth could be both the mother of gods and a power-receiving cult, then the world itself was never simply material. If Zeus could emerge from violent succession and still become the god of order and law, then political authority had a mythic model. If Demeter's grief and return were tied to agricultural ritual, then the cycle of grain could be understood as both natural and sacred. The myths created a language in which ritual acts were not arbitrary. They belonged to a wider story about the structure of reality and the maintenance of life. That language also gave communities a way to claim continuity with the past. A sanctuary was not only a place to make requests, it was a site where inherited memory, local identity, and divine ancestry met in repeated action. By the time Greek creation myth reaches the level of cult, it is no longer just an account of what came first. It has become part of how Greeks organized worship, explained sacred places, and linked human communities to the older powers behind the world. The same figures who appear in cosmogony are honored in temples, sacrifices, and festivals, but not always in the same way, and not always for the same reasons. That difference matters. It keeps the myths from becoming a closed literary system. The later history of Greek creation myths is not a single line of descent. It is a long process of reuse, interpretation, and revision. Roman poets inherited these stories and adapted them to their own language and political world. Ovid, for example, opens the Metamorphoses with a creation account that draws on Greek material, but rearranges it for a Roman literary purpose. He begins from a confused mass and then moves toward the shaping of land, sea, and sky. The sequence still owes much to Greek cosmogony, but it now serves a different aim. It becomes part of a larger poem about change, instability, and transformation. In Virgil and other Roman writers, Greek divine genealogies continue to matter, but they are often woven into accounts of ancestry, empire, or the moral order of history. The old gods are not simply copied. They are reinterpreted through Roman style, Roman values, and Roman literary goals. This adaptation was no accident. Roman literature developed in close contact with Greek education, drama, and epic, and elite Roman writers usually knew these myths through Greek models before they rewrote them in Latin. That meant creation stories could move into new settings without losing authority. A Roman audience did not need them to remain exactly as Hesiod or other Greek poets had shaped them. They needed them to carry ideas about origin, continuity, and rule. In that setting, the struggle among generations of gods could echo Roman concerns with succession, family reputation, and political order. A myth about the heavens could also become a myth about lineage and the foundations of power. This pattern of inheritance did not stop in antiquity. Greek creation myths remained useful because they offered a flexible way to think about beginnings. Later artists could return to chaos, Gaia, Cronus, or Zeus when they wanted to picture the origin of the world, the violence of succession, or the rise of lawful rule. Vase painting, sculpture, mosaics, and later European art all kept these figures visible, though not always with the same level of narrative detail. Sometimes the image mattered more than the story. Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus could stand for a whole mythic sequence even when only one moment was shown. A single figure from the cosmogony could carry a chain of associations: earth, sky, generations, conflict, and the eventual settlement of power. In visual culture, that concentration mattered. A viewer did not always need the whole plot to recognize the larger idea of cosmic order emerging from earlier disorder. Greek philosophy also kept these myths in view, even when it did not accept them literally. Some early thinkers moved away from divine family narratives and tried to explain the world through elemental change, number, substance, or reason. But they did so in conversation with the older stories, not apart from them. When philosophers spoke about order arising from disorder, or about a first principle underlying visible things, they were entering a cultural field that myth had already shaped. In some cases, they used mythic language directly. In others, they rejected the old stories while still borrowing their basic concerns. The question behind both myth and philosophy was similar. How does a structured world come from something earlier, less defined, or harder to name? That overlap helps explain why creation stories were never confined to poets alone. They formed part of a broader Greek habit of asking how forms, classes, and powers come into being. Later philosophical writers often preferred abstraction, but they did not erase the older language. Plato, for instance, can be read as working between myth and argument, sometimes using traditional divine language while also stepping back from it. The result was not a clean break with the past, it was a reordering of inherited material. Even when a thinker argued that reason, necessity, or elemental forces better explained the world, the old cosmogonies still supplied the vocabulary of firstness, sequence, and conflict. Myth and philosophy were not identical, but they shared enough concerns that each could illuminate the other. The creation myth survived in part because they continued to answer a question that technical explanation did not remove. How should one imagine the passage from an undivided beginning to a world of distinct powers and limits? That question remained important because the creation myths were never only about the past. They also offered a model for thinking about the present. If the world began through division, struggle, and arrangement, then human life could be understood in the same terms. Family conflict was not just private, it mirrored older divine conflict. Political authority was not just practical power, it could be imagined as the latest version of a much older struggle over rule. Even succession in a household could be read against the background of Cronus, Uranus, and Zeus. Greek and Roman audiences did not all interpret the stories in the same way, but the stories remained available as a framework for order, inheritance, and legitimacy. A ruler who claimed stable authority could be compared implicitly or explicitly with Zeus after the defeat of the older powers. A family dispute could be understood in terms that echoed the violence and transition of the divine generations. Later retellings often simplified what the older sources had left open. They made the cosmos seem more orderly than it first appears in poetry. They emphasized Zeus as the final ruler and treated the Titan War as a decisive ending, when the early sources can feel more provisional than that. They also blended regional traditions that had once remained distinct. Local cults, philosophical speculation, and literary retelling all fed into one another. As a result, the afterlife of Greek creation myth is not the survival of a fixed text. It is the survival of a set of powerful narrative patterns, the emergence of form, the rise of divine generations, the fall of older powers, and the division of the world into meaningful parts. That is why these myths remain foundational. They could explain why the world looked ordered, why gods were worshipped in different domains, and why human communities imagined their own institutions as part of a larger sacred history. Long after the first poets told them, the creation myths continued to shape how later cultures pictured beginnings, authority, and change. By the end of these stories, the pattern is clear. Greek creation myth begins in openness and lack, moves through conflict among divine generations, and settles, however imperfectly, into an ordered cosmos. That order is never simple. It is made through separation, struggle, and succession, and different poets preserve different stages of the process. Hesiod's Theogony gives the best-known sequence, but local traditions keep older or alternate arrangements alive. What survives is not one settled account, but a tradition that could hold chaos, kinship, and rule together. That is part of why these myths endured. They explained why the world has structure, why the gods are divided among their powers, and why human life was imagined inside a larger sacred history.